Okay, so today we're diving into, well, consciousness.
Ooh, big one.
Yeah, I mean, not just like, being awake and aware, but the really deep question of how it all works.
Right. How does the brain actually create the experience of being conscious?
Exactly. How do we get from, like, neurons and electrical signals to the feeling of having thoughts, feelings, experiences?
Like the feeling of listening to this podcast right now.
Yes. And to help us unravel this, we're turning to the work of Daniel Dennett.
A philosopher who's really made a name for himself by tackling these big questions head on.
And he's known for not shying away from challenging conventional thinking.
That's an understatement. His views can really shake things up.
So before we get into the nitty-gritty, can you give us a bit of background on Dennett? What led him down this path of questioning the very nature of our minds?
Well, even as a teenager, Dennett was already grappling with some pretty heavy philosophical stuff.
Like what?
The mind-body problem, for one.
Okay, the classic debate about whether the mind is separate from the body or somehow a product of it.
Right, and he was drawn to the work of Descartes, who famously argued for a separation between mind and matter.
But Dennett wasn't quite convinced by that, was he?
No, he wasn't satisfied with that dualistic view. He suspected there had to be a more unified explanation.
So he was already questioning some pretty fundamental ideas at a young age, but he wasn't always surrounded by philosophy and cognitive science, was he? Didn't he have a kind of unusual upbringing in that regard?
It's true, he did. He's talked about going to Sunday school as a child, even singing in the church choir.
Interesting. So he had this early exposure to religion, which seems a bit ironic considering where his thinking eventually led him.
It is interesting, and while Dennett didn't ultimately embrace religion, that early exposure probably played a role in shaping his views on belief systems and the human search for meaning.
I can see that tension between faith and reason, it's a thread that runs through a lot of his work.
Absolutely. Now, in terms of a specific aha moment that set him on the path to his views on consciousness,
Was there like a pivotal experience that shifted everything?
there was a turning point during his college years. He was studying visual perception, and he had this realization
What was it?
that the common idea of the mind playing a movie of our experiences, it just didn't hold up.
You mean that our perception isn't just a direct, unfiltered representation of the world?
Exactly. He realized that our conscious experience is more of an interpretation, a kind of construction by the brain.
It's like that moment you realize there's no single correct way to see an optical illusion. It completely changes how you think about perception.
Precisely. And that visual perception revelation, it really planted the seed for his later work on consciousness.
So the seed was planted, but when did the full picture of consciousness as a product of the brain really crystallize for Dennett?
A pivotal moment happened at Oxford. He was chatting with a friend studying medicine, and he started learning about neurons.
Ah, neurons, those tiny cells that communicate using electrical and chemical signals.
Yes. And it just clicked for Dennett. He realized that these simple units working together in these vast, intricate networks could actually be the building blocks of something as complex as the human mind.
Okay, so billions of neurons firing away. But how do we get from those electrical impulses to the feeling of, say, listening to your favorite song or smelling freshly baked bread?
Right, that's the crux of it, isn't it? That's what Dennett calls the hard problem of consciousness.
How do we get from the physical to the subjective? How do these processes in the brain create the feeling of what it's like to be conscious?
Exactly. And it's here that Dennett introduces one of his most thought-provoking and perhaps controversial ideas, the notion of consciousness as a user illusion.
Okay, user illusion. It sounds like he's saying our minds are tricking us, but in a helpful way.
In a sense, yes. Think about the interface of your smartphone.
What do you mean?
Well, you interact with icons, apps, notifications, but what you see is just a simplified representation of incredibly complex code and processes happening behind the scenes.
So much going on that we never even have to think about.
Exactly. Dennett argues that consciousness is kind of like that interface, a way for the brain to manage its own complexity and present a user-friendly version of reality to you, the user.
So instead of experiencing the raw data of billions of neurons firing, our brains create this kind of simplified, digestible version that we experience as consciousness.
Precisely. It's not that our experiences aren't real, but that our brains are presenting them in a way that allows us to function effectively in the world.
Okay, so it's like a map that shows you the major landmarks and roads, but not every single tree and pebble.
Exactly. It's a functional representation, not necessarily a perfectly accurate one.
That makes sense. Our brains are all about efficiency, after all.
Absolutely. And this idea of consciousness as a user interface has some really interesting implications for how we think about free will, artificial intelligence, and a whole bunch of other big questions.
Which I'm quite eager to get into. This whole notion that our brains are basically creating a reality show for us to experience is pretty mind-blowing. But before we jump ahead, can you give us a more concrete example of how this user illusion might work in the brain?
Sure, let's take vision, for example. When you look at something like a red apple, you perceive it as a whole unified object, right?
With a specific color, shape, and location, it seems so straightforward.
But what's actually happening in your brain is far more complex.
Oh, I'm sure it is. Break it down for us. What's going on behind the scenes?
Okay, so light bounces off the apple, enters your eye, hits your retina, gets converted into electrical signals.
Okay, I'm following so far.
And then those signals travel to different parts of your brain. Each area is specialized for processing a different aspect of the visual information, color, shape, motion, all of that happening in parallel.
So there's not just one vision center in the brain.
Nope. It's a much more distributed process than most people realize.
Fascinating. So then how does it all come together? Where's the control room that takes all this information and creates that seamless experience of seeing the red apple?
And that's precisely Dennett's point. There is no central control room, no single theater where it all comes together.
Wait, really?
Yeah, instead of everything converging in one place, it's all these different brain areas working together, contributing to this overall picture we experience.
So going back to the user interface analogy, our conscious experience of the apple is like the final image on a computer screen.
Exactly. While behind that seemingly simple image is this incredibly complex network of code and processing power that we're never directly aware of.
So essentially, our brains take all this raw sensory data, process it across different specialized regions, and then present us with this simplified, coherent representation like the red apple that allows us to actually make sense of the world and interact with it.
That's the gist of it. And this idea of the user illusion, of the brain creating this functional, simplified representation of reality, it's crucial for understanding Dennett's views on everything, from free will to the potential for artificial consciousness. It's not just about seeing an apple, though, right? Think about pain for a second.
Okay, yeah.
You feel it in a specific part of your body, like if you stub your toe.
Ouch, yeah, been there.
But that feeling, that sensation, it's not just a simple signal from your toe to your brain.
So what's happening?
It involves your nerves, your spinal cord, different parts of the brain all working together.
To create this one unified sensation of pain.
Exactly. And that's another example of the user illusion in action.
The brain is taking all this complex input and creating this simplified representation, this feeling of, ouch, pain in my toe.
Which is basically what you need to know to, stop doing whatever caused it.
Right. It's all about survival and efficiency at the end of the day.
Exactly. So we've got this user illusion. This way our brains manage all this complexity.
But then how does that work with the idea of free will? If our brains are constructing our reality, do we really have any control over our choices?
The big question of free will, definitely one of the most debated aspects of Dennett's work.
And I'm guessing he doesn't exactly hold back on this one either.
He does not. In a nutshell, Dennett argues that free will, the kind where our choices are totally independent of our brains and all the stuff happening in there, well, it's an illusion.
Oh, okay. That's a tough one to swallow. I think most of us instinctively feel like we're in control of our own decisions.
Right. And it can be a bit unsettling to think about our choices being determined by something else.
So how does Dennett explain that? How can we not have free will if it feels like we do?
He argues that our brains are constantly taking in information, past experiences, what's happening around us at that moment, our desires.
All the data, basically.
Yes. And then the brain uses that data to generate different options, different courses of action.
Like a more complex version of those choose-your-own-adventure books.
Exactly. And then the choice we make, the one that feels like a conscious decision.
That's just the outcome of all these complex brain processes that we don't even realize are happening.
Exactly. It's not that we don't make choices, it's that those choices are coming from this incredibly complex system that we don't have full conscious access to.
So it's not exactly random, but it's also not the kind of free will we imagine where we're somehow separate from our brains.
Precisely. He often uses the example of a chess-playing computer.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Even a really advanced program can evaluate millions of moves, but ultimately, Its choice, the one that seems strategic.
It's determined by its programming, the
Right.
data it's working with.
Right, just like our brains are running these incredibly intricate algorithms based on a lifetime of experiences and information.
And our conscious experience of deciding is just the tip of the iceberg.
Exactly. So are we then just robots? Just going through these pre-programmed motions? That's where things get really interesting.
Because I was going to ask, what does that mean for how we see ourselves and our place in the world?
Right, and this is a crucial point. Dennett argues that this deterministic view, this idea that our choices are the product of our brains.
It doesn't mean those choices are meaningless.
Not at all. And it doesn't mean we're not responsible for our actions.
So then how do we reconcile those two things? How can we be responsible if our choices are essentially determined?
Well, Dennett believes that if our actions really are the product of our brains,
Which are shaped by our genes, our environments.
then it becomes even more important to create societies that encourage positive values.
And to make sure people have opportunities to grow and learn and make what we consider to be good choices.
Yes, it becomes a collective responsibility to shape those conditions that influence our choices.
To create a world where people are supported and given the tools to make those good choices.
Exactly. So we might not have this absolute control over our biology, but we do have a responsibility to shape the world around us.
This whole idea of our brains being molded by our environments, it makes me think about artificial intelligence.
How so?
If we can create machines that learn and adapt, could we ever create a truly conscious machine? Something that experiences the world the way we do?
Dennett gets asked this question all the time, and he's actually quite famous for saying, "I am a robot."
He's not serious, is he?
He says it playfully, but he's getting at something important. He's saying that humans were basically biological robots.
It's really, really complex ones.
The most complex ones we know of, but robots nonetheless. So if we are just highly sophisticated machines ourselves,
Does that mean building a conscious AI is just a matter of time and better technology?
Dennett wouldn't say it's quite that simple. He doesn't rule out the possibility of artificial consciousness, but
It's not just a matter of building a bigger computer.
exactly. The human brain, with billions of neurons and trillions of connections, shaped by millions of years of evolution.
That's a level of complexity we haven't even begun to replicate in our machines.
Exactly. And this is where the user illusion comes back into play.
Okay, I see the connection. We can't just build a brain without understanding the software that makes it run.
Exactly. Even if we could build a machine with the same raw computing power as the human brain, we'd still need to figure out how the brain creates that simplified, user-friendly interface we experience as consciousness.
It's like trying to build a car without understanding how the engine works. You might end up with something that looks like a car, but it's not going to get you very far.
A perfect analogy. And this question of artificial consciousness, it's something that sparked a lot of debate among philosophers and scientists.
I bet it has.
Yeah.
So are there any big counter-arguments to Dennett's perspective on all this?
Oh, absolutely. There are some really compelling arguments out there that challenge Dennett's views. One of the most famous is Frank Jackson's thought experiment about Mary the color scientist.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that one. It's a classic.
Right. For those who haven't, picture a brilliant scientist, Mary, who lives in a black and white world.
So she's never actually experienced color herself.
Exactly. But she has access to all the physical information about color, how our eyes and brains process it, the wavelengths, everything.
But just through textbooks and black and white images, right?
Right. She's never actually seen color. So the question is, if Mary steps out of her black and white world and sees a red apple for the first time.
Would she learn anything new?
Exactly. It seems like she would, right?
I mean, even with all the scientific knowledge, there's something about the actual experience of color that seems to go beyond just the physical facts.
Right, and that's what Jackson was getting at. He argued that this thought experiment shows there are these non-physical facts about experience.
Like what it actually feels like to see red.
Exactly. Philosophers call these qualia the subjective qualities of experience. And Jackson believed that qualia can't be explained by just focusing on the physical stuff.
So where does Dennett stand on Mary and her newfound color vision?
Well, Dennett, being Dennett, has a pretty thought-provoking response.
I can imagine. Lay it on us.
He says that if Mary truly knew everything about color vision, if she really had all the physical facts,
Then she would be able to predict exactly what seeing red would be like.
yes, she wouldn't be surprised or confused. She'd be like, this is what red looks like.
So he's saying that complete physical understanding would include the subjective experience as well.
Exactly. He believes that our intuition that Mary would be surprised, it comes from our limited understanding of how complex the brain really is.
We underestimate how much information is packed into those physical facts.
Precisely. So it's not that Mary learns some new non-physical fact. It's more that she gains a new way of accessing and applying the knowledge she already has.
It's a really interesting way to think about it. Are there any other big challenges to Dennett's perspective out there?
Another famous one is Thomas Nagel's "What is it like to be a bat?" argument.
Oh, right, I've heard of that one. It's about how we can never truly understand what it's like to experience the world from another creature's point of view.
Exactly. Nagel argues that no matter how much we study a bat's brain, its echolocation, its sensory systems.
We can never truly know what it feels like to be a bat.
Precisely. We can study the physical mechanisms, but that first-person subjective experience seems to be beyond our grasp.
It's a really compelling point.
It is, but Dennett would say this limitation doesn't necessarily mean we can't have a scientific understanding of consciousness. Just because we can't directly experience the world as a bat.
Doesn't mean we can't investigate and develop theories about what bat consciousness might be like.
Exactly. It might be a different kind of understanding, but it's still a valid pursuit for science.
So we can still use the tools of science to study subjective experience, even if we can't perfectly replicate it ourselves.
Precisely. Dennett's a big advocate for science, even, or maybe especially when it comes to these big mysteries of consciousness.
He doesn't shy away from the hard questions.
Not at all. He sees these thought experiments as valuable, as ways to push our thinking, but not as reasons to give up on a scientific worldview.
It seems like Dennett's approach encourages us to be both humble about what we don't know and really ambitious about trying to figure it out.
Absolutely. He wants us to stay curious, to be open to new ideas, and to be willing to update our beliefs when new evidence comes along.
Even if those ideas challenge some of our most fundamental assumptions about ourselves and the universe.
Exactly. And that brings us to another really important aspect of Dennett's work, his atheism, and how he sees religious belief through the lens of evolution.
Right. We can't really talk about consciousness without addressing the idea of a higher power or a soul.
Absolutely. So how does Dennett approach religion, especially given his own experiences with it earlier in life?
Yeah, it's an interesting contrast, isn't it?
It is. And Dennett's view is that the tendency towards religious belief, it's actually a natural byproduct of how our brains have evolved.
What do you mean?
Well, he argues that our brains, they're pattern-seeking machines. We're wired to find explanations to make sense of the world around us.
Which is useful, but it can also lead us down some interesting paths.
Right. Sometimes we find patterns that aren't really there, or we come up with explanations that aren't entirely accurate.
And that's where things like supernatural beliefs come in.
Exactly. Think about our early ancestors. They didn't have the scientific understanding we have today. So when they were faced with something unexplained, like a storm or a disease,
Attributing it to a god or a spirit might have been a comforting way to make sense of it.
exactly. And not just comforting, it might have even been helpful for survival in some ways.
Like, if you believe the forest is inhabited by spirits, you might be more careful and avoid danger.
Precisely. But that doesn't mean those beliefs are actually true, right?
It's a matter of what was useful for survival, not necessarily what's objectively real.
Exactly. And Dennett argues that this tendency to find patterns and create narratives, it's still very much with us today.
So he's not saying that religious belief is irrational.
No, not at all. He just sees it as a natural outgrowth of how our brains work.
It's this fascinating interplay of biology and culture.
Absolutely. And while Dennett himself doesn't subscribe to any religious beliefs,
He's not out to condemn religion or tell people they're wrong for believing.
not at all. He respects that religion plays a significant role in many people's lives, and he recognizes that it can provide a sense of community, meaning, and comfort.
But at the same time, he encourages people to examine their beliefs with a critical eye.
To be open to the possibility that there might be other ways of understanding the universe, ways that don't necessarily align with traditional religious views.
It goes back to that idea of intellectual curiosity and being open to new ideas.
Exactly. And being willing to update our beliefs as we learn and grow.
I think that's a great note to end on. Daniel Dennett's work is all about asking those big, challenging questions, even if the answers aren't always easy or straightforward.
He really pushes us to think differently about who we are, how our minds work, and our place in the universe.
And that sense of wonder, that drive to explore the mysteries of the mind, I think that's something we can all appreciate, whether or not we agree with every single one of Dennett's conclusions.
Absolutely. He reminds us that the journey of discovery, of continually learning and evolving our understanding of the world, it's just as important as the destination.
Well said. And to our listeners, keep those brains buzzing. There's always more to explore on The Deep Dive.